I'm John Headley, and I'm honored to introduce an amazing presentation about a bizarre event in 1951 that could well have triggered a World War III. It's our good fortune to have a personal historical perspective of this event by our fellow resident, Tracy Winslow, who was in the midst of it and experienced it at first hand. It's taken a persistent, determined effort to get at this information through extensive research and interviews of eyewitnesses. The effort revealed that official documentation of it has been altered, hidden, or destroyed. It also reveals General Douglas MacArthur, head of Allied forces in Korea, flagrantly disobeying the policies and orders of the President, his Commander-in-Chief, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Those orders reflected the strategy of the United States to avoid any risk of expanding the combat beyond Korea. Our objective there was to repel the invaders and free South Korea. Those of you here who served in the areas of foreign and defense policy at that time may recall the serious belief that the Soviets were behind the North Korean invasion. The main goal of Soviet communist strategy in the Cold War was Germany. And there was serious concern that the Korean invasion was a diversionary plan to tie down U.S. forces in Korea and make easier a Soviet seizure of West Germany. Tracy Winslow pursued this research relentlessly, digging into the National Archives at College Park. And Raoul Drapeau has collaborated by once again applying his presentational talent to present it to us. They are indicative of the caliber of people we have in this community. And we are in for a fascinating story that begins now.
My name is Raoul Drapeau, and imagine, if you will, it's April 11th, 1951, fairly early in the Korean War. You're a 25-year-old engineering officer on board a World War II-era Navy destroyer. It's just before noon time, and your ship is more or less stationary 4 miles off the southeast coast of China, some 1,300 miles south of the Korean conflict, and you are now, your ship is surrounded by nearly 50 Chinese motorized armed junks. Soon, many U.S. airplanes are buzzing around, making threatening passes. After several hours of this, your ship leaves. You are warned by your captain never to speak of this. Later, much later, after extensive research and learning what his former shipmates had seen, you concluded that your ship's mission was to be a sitting duck, part of a secret plan by General MacArthur that intended to provoke Chinese communist forces to attack your ship. If that had happened, you could have been present at the start of World War III. This is the story of what Tracy Winslow described in his thoroughly researched book, The Swatow Incident. Here it is. We have a copy in the library up in Cardinal Clubhouse. I'll give the presentation, and Tracy will answer your questions in a question and answer session at the end. The usual safety announcement: please do not take your walkers to your seat or in the aisles. Afterwards, please allow people with EMVs or wheelchairs to leave first. So let's get started. All right, so the Korean War, oops, got to press the right button. It was a 5-year affair from June of 1950 to July of 1953. The Korean War in April 1951, which is the date that we are selecting here, April 11th, 1951 to be exact, the Korean War is raging. It's a really tough fight because a lot of it was in the wintertime on undeveloped roads. There were 37,000 Americans killed during that time, as compared to more than 10 times that number in World War II, but it still was a large number. Here's what the front looked like in April of 1951. As you can see, between the top, which is communist controlled, and the bottom, which is South Korea, for the next 2 years after April 11th, it vacillated back and forth, but still always hung around the 38th parallel. So we're 10 months into the war, 27 months to go. So it was relatively early as those things go. The two key factors, or the two key individuals involved here in this conflict that we're going to focus on, are President Harry Truman and his Far East commander, General Douglas MacArthur. Truman had some woes. Part of his woes was that he had a lot of things on his plate that he couldn't really control very well. He wasn't as brilliant a speaker and as engaging a speaker as Theodore Roosevelt was. They're in the midst of converting from a World War II wartime economy, where everybody had a job, to a peacetime economy where not so much anymore. There were some strikes everywhere. Workers were beginning to get their voices heard aggressively against their employers. Senator Joseph McCarthy was in the middle of his Red Scare tactics with all these charges that he made up out of whole cloth. Unfortunately, Truman had a few people really cheated on him, if you will, and made him look bad, like this one guy, General Harry Vaughan, who sold access to the president and to the White House to people for large sums of money. Eventually he was discovered and jailed. Then he had the big factor, which is a rebellious but militarily successful general who was placed in charge of the forces in the Far East. MacArthur was not bashful about sharing his political opinions about anything. And here's one he said. There was perhaps foresaw some of his advances that we're going to be talking about today. The tragedy of Korea is further heightened by the fact that his military action is confined to its territorial limits. In other words, he wanted to attack north, out of North Korea into China, Manchuria, to attack there. But the United Nations said, no, you can't do that. Well, he says the enemy sanctuaries are fully protected from such attack. Sort of, in a way, has some reflections on what's happening today between Ukraine and Russia. The enemy must realize that an expansion of our military operations to his coastal areas, that's an important word in this case, would doom Red China to the risk of imminent military collapse. So that thought in his mind is putting forth and help form the plan that we're going to be talking about. Paul Nissi was an important administration figure in the State Department policy planning staff. He said, quote, this is from his own book, I learned from intercepts of cable traffic coming across my desk that MacArthur's real aim was to expand the war into China, overthrow Mao Zedong, and restore Chiang Kai-shek to power. It was clear that MacArthur was headed in a most dangerous direction. So the fact that MacArthur had these things in his mind, was formulated a plan, was known and suspected, but not really known in any detail in Washington. But what was he referring to in the sense of this plan that MacArthur that we had intercepted? The NSA, by the way, was very active in this time. Talking about intercepts, that's where they came from, CIA and NSA. One of the things he's talking about was these, because MacArthur, on his own, arranged in Tokyo to visit with the ambassadors of Spain and Portugal. And he told them, as you see at the bottom there, he would succeed in expanding the Korean War into a general conflict with China. That's a pretty harsh thing to tell someone else from another country. Why did he pick those countries? Well, as it turned out, Spain and Portugal were very much right-wing countries they're not very happy with communism. And so the fact that he was telling them what he planned to do about communist China would have made them very happy, and he would have expected to have support from them. Finally, Truman, I'm sure I can hear him saying now, I'm out of patience, I'm done, I'm getting rid of that guy. So finally he had too much for all of these things. And April 11th, 1951, which in a sense is coincidentally exactly the same day this incident that we're talking about took place. It was, 2 or 3 in the morning in Washington, and Tracy in this ship, it was like in the early morning. But that was the same day. So he concluded, Truman did, with deep regret, I've concluded the General of the Army, Douglas MacArthur, is unable to give his wholehearted support to the policies of the United States government and of the United Nations in matters pertaining to its official duties. Very administratively, very politically written. But you notice here in the bottom right where I circle, where he says, this is where the Philadelphia Inquirer, whether they were just guessing, whether they had some good reportage, but he's saying to avert general war. That's why MacArthur fired him. How much Truman really knew about MacArthur's plan at this point is speculation. But somebody knew something or suspected something. So the public reason for Truman firing MacArthur was these. This is what's stated in the newspaper and by the government. He frequently disregarded the administration's orders, that's for sure. Plenty of incidences about that. He publicly spoke out against military restrictions imposed on him. He wanted to go into Manchuria, they said no. And he meddled in foreign policy and politics, again, meeting with the ambassadors of Spain and Portugal. However, there was some stuff behind that he couldn't really talk about in public. Part of it was these intercepts, where the CIA and NSA and all those don't want to talk about sources and methods. But there were methods involved. So MacArthur had these unauthorized meetings with the Spanish and Portuguese officials. That's a killer right there. But he couldn't disclose it. Truman could not act without revealing his intercepts. MacArthur characterized peace talks as a sellout. That was a bummer because Truman was very active in trying to set up peace talks to stop the violence. And finally it worked, but MacArthur was very much against that. Truman and official Washington, including his bosses, MacArthur's bosses, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, were not told about MacArthur's plan. You'll see a little more about that in a minute. So what actually was his plan? What was he trying to do? Let's talk some details about that. February 24th, this is 3 weeks or so before the actual event we're going to be talking about, he requested further authorization to attack China. 2 months to attack China. Here's what he said to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. His boss, that's who the Far East chief is reporting to. In the event of Chinese communist air or sea attacks against Formosa, now Taiwan, or the United States forces outside Korea, it is recommended that Commander-in-Chief Far East, that's him, be authorized to retaliate immediately against targets on the Chinese mainland. Well, he's already told several people, the ambassadors, for example, that it's his plan to overflow the communist China on their territory. So what he's saying is that the UN had only given him permission to attack China in Korea, and not beyond Korea, in Korea. So what he's saying, MacArthur is saying, is if they attack us outside Korea, I want the ability to immediately attack. 4 days later, the Joint Chiefs came back, and they said, yep, that's good. In the event they attack us outside Korea, the principle of immediate retaliation against Chinese on the Chinese mainland is approved. Wonderful. But then, the second paragraph, however, subject to the right of immediate self-defense, you will inform us facts concerning the Chinese communist attack and receive approval of your approved retaliatory attack prior to attacking targets. So, somebody's covering their butt on this one. They giveth, they taketh away. So clearly in MacArthur's, he would focus on the first paragraph, not the second one. The Joint Chiefs, I don't know why they wrote such a ridiculous memo. You either do it or don't do it, but they've got both bases not covered but exposed. So that's what he did, is he ran with the first paragraph. So, on April 8th, MacArthur requests to move Task Force 77. The 7th Fleet was up in the area of Korea. They established a task force, which is a small subset of that fleet, consisting of 18 ships. And they said, wait, I want to move, he requested permission to move this smaller group to the Straits of Formosa, which is like, I'll show you a map in a minute, 1,300 miles south of the battle area. He wants to do a photo reconnaissance to assure that Communist China was not preparing to invade Formosa, as a demonstration to Chiang Kai-shek of our support, and as a show of force. Okay, that's a reasonable thing to do, but that also sets him up in a position to be attacked outside Korea by China, as you'll see. So here's the Task Force 77, 18 ships. There were 2 aircraft carriers, the USS Boxer and the Philippine Sea, both Essex class, good size aircraft carriers, 12 destroyers, one of which was Tracy's destroyer, the USS Bowl, the Lofberg and the Thomason. I'll show you a map with them on it in a minute, and a light cruiser, the Juneau. Here's Western Pacific geography. Way at the top of the red line, yeah, it looks red. Okay. That's where they were in April 7th. And then they, bit by bit, they moved down. It's 1,300 miles. It takes a while to get there. And by the 11th, they were there. Notice we're at the bottom of the red line. They're kind of in between Taiwan and the coast of China. However, these motions, secret though they were, the British found out. And the king and the Foreign Office in Britain were not happy about this at all. Here's some instructions that the Foreign Service gave to their ambassador to the United States. First of all, I won't read the whole thing, but they were concerned in the first paragraph about the United States keeping sufficient control over the field commander it has selected. They knew all about MacArthur, no secret. They knew he was a wild man. Second paragraph, they wanted the American government to prevent him from trespassing into the realms of policy, which everybody knew that he did all the time. And then, this is interesting, the quote, reported naval operations off the Chinese coast. He's referring to the task force that I mentioned just now, that if bad things happen, grave responsibility that will fall on the United States government for the consequences. In other words, British are saying, hey, it's your problem. You're creating this problem. We don't want to have anything to do with it. The British were already pretty well stretched at that time. So that's a reasonable thing for them to say. But they realized that MacArthur was not the kind of guy you can control very easily. Where did the British find out about all of this? One of a group called the Cambridge Spies, Philbig, Burgess, and Maclean, who are working for the British Foreign Service in very high positions. And what they were doing, bit by bit, is sending information from their places to Moscow. And Moscow then forwarded it to Beijing, who then gave it to North Korea. But mainly, the real important recipient was Beijing. So the British knew about the plan before Washington administration knew about it. Very interesting, because of those spies. Now, the Bull, Tracy's ship, USS John A. Bull, DD 755, was a World War II class destroyer, Sumner class, relatively thin-skinned, as most destroyers are, 336 crew. Tracy was an engineering officer on board that ship. Now, the ship was in port in Japan. It got a very quick orders to join this task force. They were doing some retrofits and upgrades of things, including cryptography gear, while they were in port. And all of a sudden, now they're at sea, headed south. And there was an upgrade to their cryptography system that they wanted to have. Now, normally speaking, you do that in port. We don't send somebody out to the ship to do that when you're in a rush. And that's what they did in this case, because a cryptography expert was transferred to the bowl by means of a whaleboat, like this. This is not the actual one, but just like that. And so, as you can imagine, if the sea is a little bit rough and you're in a small boat and you're trying to transfer somebody from that small boat to a ship, that's a chancy sort of thing. If you've ever been on a cruise and your cruise ship is going into a port, they send out a pilot to guide you. And you can be really nasty weather, and the ship is tooling along, and here's the small little boat that they've got the pilot in, and he or she is, there's some of she's, jump from that boat onto some structure on the ship. It's that sort of thing. So it's not the kind of thing you do, no problem, we can do it tomorrow. They're doing it today, and we've got to get the job done. But why? Then the 10th, the day before this incident, an officer messenger was transferred to Bol. Now, what's an officer messenger? If you have just some administrative thing and you want to get it transferred and you're underway and you can't really wait until you get back to port, fine. You send some some enlisted guy, strap him into one of these things and transfer them from one ship to the other while both ships are moving ahead, which already is a little bit of a weird thing if you're all of a sudden there's a submarine detached. All those boats are going a separate way and you're in the middle. But anyhow, this happened while the ships were at sea, and on sometimes they call it a breeches buoy. This picture at the bottom right, by the way, is nothing to do with us. That's my father. Now, he was a doctor transferred from his ship to a destroyer, as a matter of fact, to do an operation. That's him hanging on for his life on this thing. But you have guys on one side, one ship pulling you over, and the other guy is pulling you back when you're finished. But you don't do that. And this is an officer, not just some some enlisted guy, but this is a high-level officer who is transferred over. He spent the day, and then the next day he's leaving. I guess it was the same day he's sent back. Now that was a very unusual operation. Why? Typically, it's only when you send a high-ranking officer, used only for messages of the highest degree of secrecy. What was that message? Here's the way it was. Look, here you are. You're about 110 miles off the coast of Formosa. That is to say, between the two places, about 110 miles. Task 47 was close. All the ships in it, now three of them had been broken away, so got 15 or so ships on that task force. They're stationed closer to the west coast of Formosa. Then we have, here is the Thomason. Remember I said there were 3 destroyers as part of this task force. The Thomason, the Fisk, that's where they were, and then the Bol. Thomason and the Fisk were located approximately 20 miles or maybe a little bit more off the coast. That was their assigned location. And the Bol was assigned to, he wasn't, what their log says is they were 20 miles off the coast. As you will see, that wasn't the case at all. Ostensibly, what were they doing there? All 3 of these guys, they were acting as bird dogs. If you're a hunter and you go out hunting in the woods or in the swamp someplace and you're shooting down migrating birds, you shoot one down, goes into the water, you have a bird dog, goes in and gets the bird for you and brings it back. Bird dog. Well, what a bird dog in this case is if they were having this parade, which is what MacArthur wanted to do, of photo reconnaissance planes or just fighter planes going along the coast of southeast coast of China to gather information, then if one of them has a mechanical problem or they get shot down and the pilot is now in the water, you're the bird dog, you're going to go find them and get them, because it would be distress calls and all of that. So that's what they were supposed to be doing there. What were they doing? Oops, I'm going to press the right button. Okay. You're now more than 20 miles away from the shore. You're on your ship, you're headed due west. Captain Buas is his name, called the crew together. This is what Tracy recalls from what the captain had said. We're now approaching Swatow, China, on a top secret mission. Okay, people had wondered because nobody was talking about where are we going, why are we here. A lot of scuttlebutt as happens on ships, particularly when they listed about, well, I know where, no, I don't know where, what's happening. And so he now says we're now approaching Swatow, China, on a top secret mission. You're not to talk about today's events to anyone on or off the ship. That's a bit unusual. Now, keep your mouth shut, and we may experience combat. Now, that would get your attention, because he knew he'd received these secret orders from this officer messenger, whatever they were. Those messages have disappeared into space. He may say, we may experience combat. If we blow up a picture of the Swatow harbor, which is now called Shantou, where they were supposed to be was out here, making a triangular course, steaming at 20 miles an hour, 12 knots, about 13 or so miles an hour, on a triangular course of 3 miles, like that, back all day long. That's what the log says they were doing. Where they actually were was here, 3 to 4 miles off the shore of Swatow. 20 miles or so away from, 15 miles or so, maybe, away from where they were, where the log and the orders say they were. They weren't there at all. They were at general quarters, which means everybody get ready, there's going to be troublesome things happening. They were at general quarters for 4 hours, starting from, I think it was 10:30 or 11 in the morning, until they left. Maintaining position. So what they're doing here is, they were supposed to be making this triangular course. What they really were doing is out here is what some people call station keeping. In other words, you were trying to maintain more or less exactly the same position. So if under the effect of tides and winds, you probably would be shifted. So therefore, you have to make motions, and you have to, from time to time, you don't want to throw an anchor out, because that's a dangerous thing to do if you're in a dangerous situation. You want to be able to escape quickly. So you just maintain that position by short movements of your ship. There are several crewmates of Tracy. I interviewed 2 of them. He interviewed more. First one, the most important one in a sense, was James Alexander. He happened to be in a position, his general quarters position was main battery control. He could still look out and see what was happening. He wasn't hidden in the bowels of the ship. He could see. And these are some of the quotes from, he wrote a book. By 11 in the morning, we had to take a position 3 miles off Swatow, a major port city, which it is. Within minutes of our arriving, armed motorized junks began to converge around us. Armed junks kept streaming out of the Han River estuary, which is where the port is, and eventually the count got to 47. They took positions about 8/10 of a mile away. That's pretty darn close. They're armed, you're in their territory, nobody's fired a shot yet, and you're surrounded. By the way, what the captain was worried about is that chances are, with the weapons they have on the destroyer, they could have fought back if the armed junks had decided to attack them. But still, there were a lot of them there, and what the junks could do is head in towards the ship, some of them, and throw ropes, cables into their screws or the rudder of the ship, and basically disable it. Now you're in serious trouble. So that was one of the things that they were worried, the captain was worried about. I talked to Sam Stock. Sam was a surface radar operator, so he could see on his radar presentation where they were in relationship to the shore and whatever was going on around them, like these Chinese junks. 3.5 to 4 miles from shore, maintained that position very tight, meaning they were basically stationary. There were too many junks to count on the radar, because the radar didn't have that good resolution. They were all around the ship about a mile away, kind of floating along very low speed. So those 2 interviews produced very similar results in terms of what they saw. Claude Gray This is actually his personal journal. He wrote all this stuff down. Instead of having you read that, I transcribed it. And here's what he's saying on those 2 pages. April 8th, a couple of days before, no one seems to know where we're going. And that's to be expected, particularly if you're on a secret mission. You can guess. You've read things in the paper and so on, but still you don't know for sure. So on April 11th, the appointed day, we arrived in Swatow about 10 in the morning. There were he counted 41 junks. Just off the coast, our purpose was to scare the Chinese Reds from invading Formosa. Now that's one of the things that was in the papers. Everybody knew that the Chinese communists were making threatening motions against Taiwan. Does that sound familiar? And then he also says planes from 77, the Task Force 77, flew over at 3 p.m. And actually they didn't just fly over, they were going back and forth, making simulated strafing motions. This guy, this handsome dude behind me, he said, I could tell from the engine room that we were either holding position or making minor changes. So how do you know that? You can't see anything out, you can't see the propellers going, but you're in the engine room, you can actually, you can feel, you can see, you can hear the engines moving. When they're moving, you know it. So that's easily understood. We were continually receiving intermittent short bells of 1/3 ahead or astern, so I realized we're essentially stopped, and that's what everybody's saying. We hadn't moved very far between 11 in the morning and 4 p.m. So, those are the interviews we had with the individuals who were there. Very few of them are still alive, but we have captured that information. What relevant documents are that we can hang our hats on? This is probably the most important one. A deck log on a ship is like a journal that you might keep of what you did today. With a ship, though, in the Navy, it's more than that. It's actually a legal document of what went on. If something important happens during the day and it's your watch, you're supposed to be keeping this log, and somebody falls overboard, you're going to put that on. Somebody fires at you, you're going to put that down. Anything of importance, you would make sure that you would put down. So you'll see here that this is the April 11th version of the dog. And by the way, if you, as a person on that ship, or even later, you don't like what you see on the log, and you erase it, and maybe it's in pencil, or somehow or other you erase it and change something about it, that's a court-martial offense. If you put something down and delete it later on, that's a court-martial offense. If you don't put something down of key importance, that's a court-martial offense. What you'll see here is, it said at 11 in the morning, they were on Bird Dog Station off Swatow, China. Now what does off Swatow, China mean? It could be 100 yards, it could be 100 miles. You don't know. It's not specific. Here, however, in another place, we have the documentation shows the noontime position of the ship as being consistent with what it was supposed to be doing. Then the next thing is that it says that we were steaming. You're underway. Your engines are moving. You're making steam through the water. Your speed was 12 knots. And this is the triangular pattern. This is what you're supposed to be doing. And at 10:30, you exercise at general quarters. Remember I told you earlier there were general quarters for 4 hours or 5 hours? This is saying you're at general quarters at 10:30, and at 11, 10 minutes after 11, you secured for general quarters. Interesting stuff. That's not what happened. Basically, everything you just seen there, except where it says we're off the coast of Swatow, is a lie. It's wrong. Now, how did it get to be wrong? You've got these guys here who signed it. And Tracy knew them. Unfortunately, they're gone now, and they didn't talk. They were probably given specific orders to create a false log. I don't know. We'll probably never know. But that is a very important piece of evidence. Now, these airplanes that were buzzing around, what do we know about that? The U.S. Boxer, right up here. That was stationed 170 miles or so away from Swatow at that time. On the 11th of April, they had 60 sorties launched for air parades for southwest China, and 6 photo sorties were launched with 6 jet escorts for photo reconnaissance. Okay, that's good. Now, if we could get the photographs, the film, from the photo reconnaissance as they were going over Swatow, that would be wonderful, because if nothing else, if they saw a picture of the ship, of Tracy's ship, and there was a wake behind it, that would show that they were underway, doing that triangular pattern. If there was no wake, they were stopped, or they were closely to stopped. And unfortunately, we don't have that. Why don't we have it? There is, up in College Park, at the National Archives, that's where they keep all this kind of stuff from that period of time. They have all the photo reconnaissance film. We're talking about a film that's about 10 inches wide by hundreds of feet long. That's what the photo reconnaissance planes use when they're taking a picture, usually at altitude, 10,000 feet or so, once in a while down low. That's what they use. There were 3,438 cans. Each can holds one film, typically, from the Korean War. 18 of those, they have a big database. 18 of those cans had a 1951 dates. None of them had April 11th. Let that sink in for a minute. None of them had the April 11th date. Where are they? What really happened on April 11th? The bowl maintained its position 4 miles offshore between 11 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon. That's a definitive. The logbook says Bowl was 20 miles out, running at 12 knots. Not true. They were surrounded by 40 to 47 armed junks. Nothing to dispute that. That's supported by 3 or 4 of the interviews. The Bowl is unsupported, which is kind of interesting. They really left him out there hanging because the nearest aircraft carrier was 170 miles away. And the nearest ships that could provide support were the 2 accompanying destroyers, and they were a long ways away as far as the steaming speed of a ship is concerned. The U.S. planes made passes for 2 hours. It's not indicated. That would definitely be on the log book. It wasn't. And no shots were fired on either side. Why not? If you're the Chinese and you've got these spies working for you, you know why that ship, the Bowl, was there. You're not going to touch it with a 10-foot pole. And the Bowl did not want to shoot at them, unless they tried to board the ship, perhaps, because then that would mean we incited the attack. They wanted to come the other way. Didn't happen. And the Bowl exited 1 hour after the planes departed. In spite of all that, there are some questions that remain. Okay, why was Task Force 77 moved 1,300 miles from the war zone down to between Formosa and the southeast coast of China? Well, the war was not going very well. It was about a third of the way through the war, back and forth, around the 38th parallel. And those assets, those 18 ships, were needed in Korea to help support the defense of South Korea. Why move them 1,300 miles away? It didn't make sense logically. Whoops, wrong button. What was the Bowl's assignment? Well, they were supposed to be providing assistance to aircraft that were conducting photo reconnaissance and this parade of aircraft down the southeast coast. Bird dog. Well then, if that was the case, that was a perfectly reasonable assignment. That's what the log said. But then why was the Bowl over 15 miles from its assigned position and stopped instead of following a triangle route? Now, if you're on the ship, doesn't matter how tall the ship is, and there's something that's 20 miles away, unless it's Mount Everest maybe, you can't see it. Anything more than about, if you're 100 feet up off the ground, about the farthest you can see is about 10 miles. Anything else. So if you're 20 miles out, you're not seeing it. So to say that these guys who were reporting they were just 3 miles off, they could be wrong. No, they're not wrong. Because you can tell it when you're 20 miles out, because you can't see anything. Why didn't they attack the bull, the junks? They knew, because of the spies, that MacArthur had permission to respond to Chinese attacks outside the Korean theater of war. They didn't want to get their port blockaded or have themselves attacked. They weren't really a very strong military force. They had it all concentrated in Korea, not along the coast. So how come you never heard of this before? Well, that's very interesting. The incident was not generally known until the 1990s, when the guy Gem MacArthur wrote the book. He found out by some means that that whole experience had been declassified. And so he wrote his book using unclassified material, or declassified. MacArthur was a very popular figure. You know that from all his success in World War II. And information that challenges that reputation is not well received. You can understand that. And there were a number of high-level naval officers who knew of and carried out this plan. Their careers could be ruined if it became known what they were doing something that was clearly illegal and not approved. Key documents are missing from the archives. Tracy had several FOIA requests turned down by CIA and others and NSA. They're not willing to share the information. And key documents redacted and are missing, hindering research. So what are the existing proofs? The interviews with crew members, the logbooks of the ships involved, it's the Ball and the aircraft carrier, books by crew members and others, and official records and statements. They all support, the ones that are available and not missing, all support the contention. Now there is some additional evidence if it can be found. You know, if we had unlimited monies to support and to dig into this, research it, we'd probably find some of these other pieces of evidence. But that's a big project. The ambassador's reports of the meeting with MacArthur, we contacted both the embassies of Spain and Portugal to ask them, please look for your files on this date. What do you have? And they were not able to find anything, which is unusual because they keep very careful records of other dates. They did. The secret order 7551. This is the order that the Bowles captain would have had known about and received, perhaps indeed the order that he got from the officer messenger, telling them what to do. That would be a wonderful thing. But unfortunately, when Tracy and I went to archives, there was no 7551. There was 70, others in the 70s, but not 75, is gone. Pilot report transcripts. Well, first of all, the photo reconnaissance photographs, those are missing. Pilot report transactions, those are kept. What the pilots are supposed to, when they come back on a mission like this, make a report. Those are missing as well. So what do we conclude from this? We conclude, based on reasonable evidence, I believe, the officer messenger carried the orders that required the bowl to position itself close to Swatow Harbor. The bowl was to be there to be a sitting duck to draw fire. The bowl was nowhere near the position shown in the log, and other aspects of the log were incorrect as well. The plan was to attack China if bowl was fired on. So they get fired on. So the bowl receives it's sunk. All kinds of fire. What happens then? MacArthur was not going to let that go unreported. So then that's going to be the start of a major attack. And he worked very close to Formosa at that time. A lot of national Chinese forces were chomping the bit, ready to go. And certainly Chiang Kai-shek was as well. He wanted to restore China. So what would have happened there or not, but it would have been a major attack by the UN, not the UN forces, the American forces only, forget the British, they're not involved, against China, perhaps a weakened China. That would have been a major conflict. MacArthur said victory was in his grasp. He referred to that after he got fired in his book. Victory was within my grasp. What do you think he meant by that? No shots were fired since China knew of the plan. We conclude that. Joint Chiefs and Truman did not know of his plan. That's a fact. Admiral Turner Joy, who was the guy who in charge of the Far East of the 7th Fleet, he most certainly was involved, because if you're in charge of 100 ships and you take 18 of them away from your forces, providing support for your ground forces, and take them 1,300 miles away, people are going to ask questions. So clearly you knew about it. And by good luck, we avoided World War III. Your questions, please. And if you want to follow more of this, I mentioned Tracy's book is in the library upstairs. These are some other documents and whatnot that you can look at. They're books. They're available in public libraries, and to help support it. So we got plenty of time for questions. So Tracy, it's all yours.
Okay. I think you heard me saying that I think Raoul did an excellent job and a lot of work. You know, we started on this
5 years ago.
Before COVID. We stopped, then we got back on it again, did more investigation. And as I said, John Hedley's introduction sort of sets the mood and indicates the severity and the gravity of the situation that the country was in. And essentially, nobody to this day, that is very few to this day, you're part of the 1,000 of our population that knows anything about this. It's my guess, the number. But we were very close to getting into a shooting war with China. The military commanders out there, apparently, according to Admiral Joy, he didn't know any of them that thought the Soviets would come in on it. We had the atomic bomb, they had it, but they had no means of delivering it. We had several times as many as they, and I think our military commanders, there were members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff that didn't like the restrictions that had been placed upon our forces. They felt that we could have won the war if we and brought the Red Chinese to heel if they didn't have these restrictions of not being able to attack mainland China or the Chinese. Our allies, who contributed 10% of the effort, were dead set against it, unanimously against anything that would expand the war into China. And MacArthur felt that his hands were tied. In fact, as Raoul mentioned, and you may have recalled, that on the day he was relieved of his command, he said victory was in his book. He says victory was in his grasp. 3 weeks earlier, he had sent a message to, it's all documented, to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, telling them that there was no way we can get the Korean Peninsula totally free with the restrictions that have been placed upon me. That was just 3 weeks before victory was in my grasp, according to what he wrote in his book. 9 days later, he appeared before Congress, and again he stated there was no possible way of really getting victory in Korea with the restrictions that had been placed upon me. Now, I've talked enough, so we have some questions. MacArthur certainly agrees with that. The American population in general, I think, agreed with MacArthur. You probably heard of all the turmoil, or you probably recall it. All the turmoil that occurred when the nation found out that MacArthur had been fired. But I don't think our nation was truly willing to get in a serious war again, like World War III, but they thought MacArthur would win it without it having to expand. And I personally do not know. We had a lot more atomic bombs than the Soviets had. They had just fired the first one in 1949, and they did not have the means of delivery, and so it seemed, yes, you're right. But we were really not geared up for war. None of our allies were. We were gung-ho. Most of our allies were happy to see MacArthur go. The American people were not. We did not have the standing army that the Soviets had. They retained their strength after World War II ended. They retained their military, and it would take us some time to build up. The Soviets, the fear was that the Soviets could overtake Europe in a matter of just a few weeks before we could build up our fortress to hold them back. So I agree. MacArthur certainly felt he could do it. None of our military commanders believed the Soviets would enter, but I don't know. That's all I can say about that. The previous day, it was on the 10th of April, it was when this officer messenger came aboard. I don't know his name, there's no record we can find of his name, but the ship that brought him to us on the 9th of April, the day before that, and it was the Philippine Sea, was where the Admiral, the 7th Fleet Admiral Harold Martin, was on board it. And right around noon, a plane landed, and a rear admiral stepped out of that plane. I don't know, have no record where it came from. I have my suspicions. I think it was flown in from Tokyo, and he was escorted to the Philippine Sea logbook says nothing about it. A plane landed, but the 7th Fleet Commander's log, he kept his staff kept his log also. It gave the name of the admiral who came. That admiral disappeared into the admiral country of the ship. There's a whole deck. There's a whole deck of the island of a carrier that is designated for the flag. And so this is where Admiral Martin kept his staff and where he conducted operations. But 4 hours later, the ship that took the officer messenger to the bowl departed. 4 hours later, that was about 6 o'clock in the afternoon. At the same moment, the bowl departed from its patrol. It was on patrol in the strait. It departed, and the two ships met about 70 miles north of Taiwan. He transported aboard another destroyer 12 hours after he'd come aboard us, and we took off for Swatow. So I don't think our captain was being I think how you put it, he wasn't trying to put anything over on us. Nothing was said about anything until we had quarters for muster at 8 o'clock the morning of the 11th. He got up on the public address system so the whole crew could hear, and he told us, we may see combat today. We were 1,300 miles from where the combat was going, so that was a big surprise to all of us. And he said, we'll be going to general quarters, and what was said, we're going to defend the ship, and we're not to ever tell anybody about it, nor were we allowed to discuss it amongst ourselves. 10:30, we went to general quarters. 11 o'clock, the ship's engine stopped. I could tell, well, I was down there where the engine order telegraph was sending us messages from the bridge. We stopped. And every once in a while, they start up again for a minute or so at 1/3 speed. So we were holding position at a spot which I was not aware of until I read a book from this Jim Alexander 45 years later. Well, actually, it was 2 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the afternoon when he was fired. As I looked to see what, it happened to be, it was 1 o'clock in the morning in Washington, D.C., 2 o'clock in the afternoon where we were, 3 o'clock in the afternoon in Tokyo where MacArthur was. And I believe it was preordained, I think it was in the, I never saw these papers, Raoul and I tried to find them. It was a Secret Operations Order number 75-51. And I think it was preordained that the three bird dog stations all left their, destroyers all left their stations at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And I think that was the original plan when they sent out the operation order. We haven't been able to find a copy of it. We did find a carbon copy. I found a carbon copy of where the Admiral Martin, had requested 75-1. The operation plan was, I found a carbon copy of where the cruiser who was with the task force was returning all of these papers concerning this operation to the Admiral. I don't know whether that's common experience or not to do that, but so whether they were hiding that operation plan and what was in it, I don't know. I was not aware of the I think it was a destroyer leader or something like that that was named after Admiral Joy. I do know about Admiral Joy that he was could be the real instigator of this operation we're talking about. He wrote a book shortly a few months after this occurred. He became they started negotiations between the communists to try and us to bring the war to a close. And he was the initial negotiator. And he wrote a book named How Communists Negotiate. And he was just as strong as MacArthur in his beliefs in this. So he could have been the main instigator. He may have come up with the idea, and MacArthur worked with him to carry it out. Now, I was asked by a historian, why would the Navy be doing this? The Navy can't expand the war. Well, MacArthur had a plan, I feel quite certain. He had a plan of exactly what bombers he was going to send where, what troops he was going to send where, in order to get the war expanded. I agree, but I don't know how winnable it was. Was our country in the mood? We know the Europeans weren't in the mood to get into an expanded war, so we would have been pretty much on our own if we had. And the people, when MacArthur was fired, they were really worked up, but could MacArthur have done it without the full support? Now, I believe what his plan was is to get some of our troops in a perilous position. This is my idea. I could find nothing to back this up. Put them in a perilous position such that Truman be sort of forced to man up more to allow Chiang Kai-shek and his forces to come in. This is strictly speculation as to what MacArthur's plans were had he gotten into the war. But it's true that if it had worked out the way he wanted it to do, which was to remove the communists from power, the world could be much different today and much better. On the other hand, it could have been much worse. All I know.